She was 68. She was alone. She was reading a book. He ruthlessly grabbed her anyways. What Sheriff Ronald Smith didn't know, the quiet woman he'd just assaulted had raised a son who advises the Pentagon, and this was going to be his last assault as a police officer. Do you know that there are places in the United States and United Kingdom where the law isn't a shield, it's a weapon? Where a uniform doesn't represent justice, it represents who gets to decide what justice means. Milbrook, Georgia was one of those places. Population, 4,200. One main street, 3 churches, and for 9 years, one man who ran all of it like it was his personal kingdom. Sheriff Ronald Smith had never been challenged, not once. Not by the mayor, not by the town council, not by the men who watched him and said nothing, not by the women who moved quieter whenever he walked in a room. He had built his authority the way all unchecked men build it, brick by brick, fear by fear, until the whole town was a structure that existed to hold him up. He thought Thursday, July 12th would be like every other day. He was wrong. Because that morning, he walked into Lou's family dinner and grabbed a 68-year-old woman by the arm and dragged her out like she was nothing, like she was no one, like 6 decades of dignity could be canceled in 30 seconds by a man with a badge and too much certainty about how far his power reached. Her name was Catherine Carlock, and she had a son. What Sheriff Ronald Smith didn't know, couldn't have known, because Catherine was too humble to ever mention it, was that her son sat in a secured office at the Pentagon, that he advised generals, that his clearance was higher than most senators would ever see, and that he was, at that exact moment, 40 minutes outside of Milbrook with birthday flowers on the passenger seat. This is the story of what happens when the wrong man grabs the wrong woman in front of the wrong witness, and what it costs him before the sun goes down. Hey, pause for a second and hit the subscribe button. This story is just getting started, and what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about power, justice, and the people we are too quick to underestimate. Let me ask you, what will you do if you have the power to bring down these types of ruthless police officers? Tell us in the comments section. Let's begin our story. The bell above the door didn't jingle. It clanged, sharp and violent, like a warning shot fired into a room that had been holding its breath. Lou Beaumont looked up from behind the counter. His hand, which had been refilling a coffee mug for the woman in booth 4, went still. The regulars, a retired postal worker, 2 men who drove in from the county line every Thursday, a young mother with a toddler on her hip, all of them stopped mid-motion. Forks suspended, conversations severed at the root. The temperature in Lou's family dinner dropped the way it always dropped when Ronald Smith walked through a door. Not from the air conditioning, from something older and less mechanical, the instinct that lives below language, in the part of the body that knows before the brain does. Catherine Carlock didn't look up. She was reading one of her favorite books, 3rd time through. The morning light fell across the page in long gold bands, and her coffee had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago, and she was at a passage she'd been thinking about since last Thursday, and where else did she have to be? She was 68 years old. She had buried her parents, her husband, 2 childhood friends, and the version of this town she'd grown up loving. She had washed dishes and raised a son and organized church fundraisers and survived grief of the particular variety that doesn't announce itself with drama, but moves into you quietly and rearranges the furniture. She was small, 5'2", silver hair pinned back, hands that showed every year she'd lived. She was sitting in her usual booth near the window, and she was simply present, occupying her corner of the world with the unperformed ease of a woman who had nothing to prove to anyone. That ease, that undisturbed quiet, it crossed the diner like a signal. Ronald Smith saw it from across the room, and something in him pulled toward it the way a lit match pulls toward gasoline.
He started walking. His boots were heavy. Each step was deliberate. He wore mirrored sunglasses even inside because he liked how terrible he made people feel, how his dark glasses hid the ability to read him, to prepare for him, to feel anything other than exposed. He was 6'3" and carried 280 pounds the way a man carries entitlement, without apology, without awareness of the space he consumed. He stopped at the edge of her table. He stood there, waited. Catherine finished her sentence, tucked a receipt between the pages as a bookmark, looked up. The look on her face when she saw him, it wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something older, something a woman accumulates over 68 years of navigating the arithmetic of how much space she's permitted to take up, how long she's permitted to stay, how much dignity she can assert before it reads to someone as provocation. She recognized what this was. She'd seen it before. "Morning, Sheriff," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. Armor that had been fitted and worn so many times it no longer felt like armor at all. Smith didn't answer right away. He looked at her coffee cup, her book, the empty plate she'd long since pushed aside. He looked at her like a man looks at something he intends to move. "You've been here a while," he said. It wasn't a question. "Before we proceed, let me tell you a bit about the city and how Catherine was able to live and survive there for over 40 cold years."
"I'm gonna need you to leave now." Catherine's hands were still on the table. She steadied them deliberately, pressing her palms flat against the cool formica. "I'll finish my coffee and go," she said. "2 more minutes." "No." He reached down, his hand wrapped entirely around her upper arm, her thin, 68-year-old arm, which held no threat, which carried only the accumulated weight of a long and quiet life, and he gripped it the way a man grips something he has already decided belongs to him to move. Catherine gasped. The sound was small, brief, the involuntary exhalation of a body registering pain before the mind catches up. "Sheriff, please!" "Don't please me." He pulled her from the booth. She was not a large woman. The motion was sharp and economical, and it sent her stumbling forward. Her knee caught the edge of the table. The coffee cup tipped, cold coffee spreading across the formica, dripping onto the floor in slow brown rivulets. Her book fell. The pages splayed open, her receipt bookmark sliding out and landing face down on the linoleum. Beloved, open and helpless on the floor of Lou's family diner. "Sheriff!" Lou's voice cracked. "Stop it! You're hurting her!" Smith had both hands on her arms now, his fingers pressed into the flesh of her biceps, and she could feel them, each one individually, like brands being applied with patience. He marched her toward the door. Her feet scrambled to keep pace. Her sensible shoes scraped the floor. "You think you can ignore me?" he hissed, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. "You think because you're some old church lady you don't have to listen? I'm the law here. When I say move, you move." Catherine didn't answer. She was thinking of Thomas, of the way he'd gone very still at a gas station in 1987 when a man had grabbed her wrist. Thomas had been a gentleman, gentle in a way that surprised people who expected something different from someone his size, who worked construction. But she had seen him cross a line exactly once, calm and certain and very quiet. The man had let go. She was thinking, don't call Victor, don't involve him. He has his own life, his own burdens. This is not his fight. She thought those things as Smith shoved her out the door. The September heat hit her like a wall. She stumbled forward onto the sidewalk, catching herself against a parking meter. Her palms pressed into the hot metal. She stood there, breathing. Behind her, the door swung shut. She stood alone on the street in the morning light. She looked at her wrists. Dark red marks, finger-shaped, were already rising on both upper R's.
She watched them the way you watch a bruise forming, with a kind of detached recognition, the way your body confirms what just happened, even when your mind is still processing. Inside the diner, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Except one person. Emma Bledsoe was 22 years old. She had been standing near the kitchen door when it happened, and her hand had moved to her apron pocket before she'd consciously decided to move it. The phone was already recording. She'd pressed the button without fully understanding that she'd pressed it, the way the body sometimes acts on convictions the mind hasn't finished forming yet. She stood very still now and watched Mrs. Carlock through the window. She watched the older woman take 3 slow breaths. She watched her smooth the front of her dress. She watched her reach down, pick up her dignity like a dropped item, and settle it back around herself. Emma's hands were shaking. She looked down at her phone, at the video she had just recorded. She thought, I don't have a plan. I don't have connections. I have $11 an hour and a phone and the number from Mrs. Carlock's emergency card, which was still sitting in the purse she'd left behind in the booth. The card read in neat handwriting, Victor Carlock, son, in case of emergency. Emma stared at it for a long moment. Then she typed. He'd left Washington at 4:30 in the morning. The city was still dark when he pulled onto the interstate, the dashboard lit soft, and the passenger seat held a bouquet of flowers he'd picked up the night before, zinnias and black-eyed Susans, because those were what grew in her garden, and she'd once told him that flowers should look like they belonged to something. The back seat held a box of cake from a bakery near his apartment, chocolate with buttercream frosting, which she would call unnecessarily fancy, which was partly why he'd gotten it. Victor Carlock was 42 years old, though most people who met him professionally assumed he was older. He carried himself with the kind of authority that aged him in others' eyes, not the performed authority of a man who needed to remind you of his rank, but the quieter kind, which is harder to acquire and more difficult to shake. He had close-cropped hair growing gray at the temples, and his mother's eyes, deep-set, steady, the kind that made people feel simultaneously seen and uncertain about what had been observed. His job title, in its unclassified version, was Senior Policy Advisor, Office of the Secretary of Defense. The actual job was considerably more specific and considerably more sensitive. He advised on critical infrastructure protection and coordination between the Department of Defense and the intelligence community on threats that most Americans would never hear about. He held a top-secret SCI clearance. He had been in rooms where decisions were made that would remain classified for the next 50 years. He'd taken the leave request because he hadn't seen his mother since Christmas, and because he'd accumulated 3 months of unused time over 5 years of never going anywhere that didn't orbit the work. Today, he was not a Pentagon official. He was a son going home to surprise his mama. He'd been making good time when the text came in. The preview appeared on his mounted phone at 2:47 p.m. Mr. Carlock, this is Emma from Lou's Diner. It's about your mother. He pulled over immediately, hazard lights on. He read the full message 3 times. Then he called her. 6 rings. 7. Hello? Her voice was smaller than usual, tired in the way that isn't about sleep. Mama? He could hear the edge in his own voice, that particular compression that happens when something large is being held at careful distance from the surface. What happened at the diner this morning? A pause. He knew that pause. She'd been deploying it his entire life, the breath she took when she was deciding not how to answer, but whether to. The pause itself was an answer. It meant the information existed. It meant it was significant. It's nothing, sweetheart, just a misunderstanding with the sheriff. Emma texted me. She said you hurt her. Emma shouldn't have done that. Her voice had a tremor now, anger threaded through something else. Shame, maybe. The shame of a woman who had spent decades managing her dignity quietly without asking anyone to witness it, suddenly being witnessed. I'm 20 minutes outside of Milbrook. Silence. Victor? What? I was coming to surprise you for your birthday. I'm pulling back onto the highway now. I'll be there soon. Don't go anywhere." "Baby, you don't need to—" "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." He hung up before she could argue. Then he opened Emma's text and typed, "Send me the video now. Don't delete it from your phone. Don't show it to anyone else yet. I'll explain when I get there." The video arrived in 30 seconds. He pressed play. He watched his mother stumble. He watched her reach for the parking meter. He watched the door swing shut on her. He watched it twice. His hands were shaking when he set the phone down. He noticed the shaking with the detached part of his brain that always kept watching, identified it as adrenaline, cataloged it, and began working around it. He'd learned a breathing technique years ago from a field officer who told him the goal wasn't to stop feeling, it was to feel without being commanded by the feeling. 3 breaths. Then he put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway. The flowers were still in the passenger seat. The cake was still in the back. Victor Carlock was no longer driving home for a birthday party.
The porch swing his father had built was still there. Victor stood at the bottom of the front steps for a moment, just looking at it. His father had built it the summer Victor turned 16, and Victor had helped, or tried to, mostly holding pieces in place while Thomas measured and remeasured, a habit his son had apparently inherited without realizing. They'd painted it white to match the shutters, and his mother had brought them lemonade and sat in the new swing and declared it the finest piece of outdoor furniture in 3 counties, and Thomas had grinned like a kid. Thomas had been dead for 4 years. The swing had been repainted twice since then. Victor walked up the front path, unlocked the door with the key he'd carried for 24 years, stepped inside. Mama. She came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel, and when she saw him standing in the living room with the flowers, something in her face gave way. Not all at once, slowly, like a wall that had been holding something heavy for a very long time. "Oh, baby," she whispered. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her carefully into his arms, careful not to grip, careful of her arms, and she pressed her face against his chest and held on. He felt her shaking, not crying, trembling, the way a person trembles when they've been holding something too tightly for too long, and someone finally lifts it from their hands. They stayed like that for a long moment. When she pulled back, he looked at her face. She looked older than she had at Christmas. The shadows under her eyes were the kind that didn't come from a single bad night. "Let me see your arms," he said gently. "Victor." "Mama." She set down the dish towel. She rolled up her sleeves slowly. The bruises were deep purple and red, finger-shaped, both arms wrapping around her biceps like something intentional. On her right wrist, a scrape from the parking meter, the skin still raw at the edges. Victor looked at them for a long time. His expression didn't change. That stillness, Catherine recognized it. She'd seen it on Thomas's face exactly once. Not calm, calm's controlled cousin. The expression of a man deciding exactly what to do with something very large that has just been placed in his hands. "Victor," she said carefully, "don't do something you'll regret." "I'm not going to do anything I will regret," he said. "I promise you that." He took out his phone. "But I need you to tell me everything that happened. Don't leave anything out." So she told him. She told him precisely the way she told things. She'd taught Sunday school for 30 years, and a wandering story lost children in 30 seconds flat. She told him about the empty tables, the loitering accusation that wasn't a loitering ordinance, the refusal to let her finish her coffee, the grip, the shove. "He's done this before," she added quietly. "Not to me specifically, but everyone knows the pattern. He targets people, usually black folks, usually the ones he thinks won't fight back." She paused.
Last year, he arrested Pastor William's nephew for suspicious behavior. The boy was walking home from basketball practice, 18 years old. Another pause. He shut down Mrs. Chen's restaurant for code violations that disappeared once she started paying him monthly consulting fees. "How long?" Victor asked. She gave him the look, the one she'd perfected over decades of managing people who were just discovering things she had known for years. Patient, devastating. "Baby," she said quietly, "who would we report it to? He is the law here." Victor was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Not about revenge. He had worked in systems long enough to understand that revenge was a short circuit, satisfying for a moment, useless for the structure. What he was thinking about was accountability, mechanism, leverage, the specific points where a system could be made to hold someone responsible. He had spent 20 years learning exactly where those points were. He made 3 phone calls. They were not the calls a private citizen would make.
The first call was to Emma. He thanked her for the video. He asked if she'd be willing to give a formal statement. There was a pause on her end. He recognized the pause, had been hearing it all day in this town. The pause where someone does the calculation about what resistance costs. And then she said yes, clearly, immediately. He thanked her with a warmth he meant. The second call was to a number in Washington that rang in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Criminal Section. Victor knew the section chief personally. They'd worked a joint task force 2 years ago. A methodical man, committed to the work in a way that wasn't performative. "Mark, it's Victor Carlock. I need a personal favor." He explained the situation in precise, factual language. The video, the witness accounts, the pattern of behavior. 9 years of documented and undocumented complaints. He kept his voice level. He did not editorialize. He let the facts do the work they were built to do. There was a pause, then, "Send me the video." Victor did. "Victor," Mark said after a moment, "this is deprivation of rights under color of law, textbook." "I know, and I believe if someone starts pulling on the thread, it unravels considerably. I'll make some calls." The third call was to the FBI field office in Albany. The special agent in charge was a woman named Rebecca Harding. Victor had met her at an interagency conference in 2021. They'd bonded over shared frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency and a shared admiration for a monograph on institutional failure that almost nobody had read. He'd sent her a copy afterward. She'd sent him a postcard from her vacation. "Thanks for ruining it." "Rebecca, Victor Carlock, I'm calling about a civil rights matter in Milbrook, Georgia. Small-town sheriff, pattern of abuse, 9 years. I have video." "Today?" she said, because Rebecca Harding did not waste time expressing surprise. "If possible. I'll send 2 agents this evening. Give me everything you have." He gave her everything. By 5 p.m., the machinery had started moving. By 6, 2 FBI agents were in a dark SUV heading toward Milbrook. By 7, Ronald Smith was about to have the worst night of his life, though he didn't know it yet. In the kitchen, Catherine made dinner. Roast chicken, collard greens, cornbread. She cooked the way she always cooked when the world became difficult, with precision and focus, and the particular grace of a woman who'd turned a practical skill into a form of resistance. The house filled with the smell of it. Victor sat at the kitchen table and worked his phone, and they talked between calls about other things, his work, in the broad strokes he could share, her garden, the church choir's upcoming performance of Handel. At some point, she laughed at something he said, a real laugh. He felt a knot loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was there. Later, over birthday cake that she called unnecessarily fancy in exactly the way he'd predicted, she looked at him across the table. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Can you actually do anything, or is this going to go nowhere, like it always does?"
Victor was quiet for a moment. Through the screen door, the Georgia night had come in. Crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the particular deep country silence that felt like something physical after 20 years in cities. "I think it's going to go somewhere, but I want to be honest with you. I'm not certain. Federal civil rights cases take time. Evidence gets contested. There's no guarantee. But you think it's real?" "I think the evidence I've seen tonight is as clear as evidence gets, and I think when the FBI starts pulling this apart, they're going to find more." He paused. "The question is whether there are enough victims willing to talk." "There will be," Catherine said quietly. "The moment people understand it's the FBI asking, and not Smith's people, there will be." She was right. She was right about most things. 45 minutes later, at Hal's Tavern, Ronald Smith's phone rang.
Smith had been nursing a bourbon when Deputy Lewis called. He'd been thinking, off and on throughout the day, about the Carlock woman, the composed look she'd had before he'd wiped it off her face, the way she'd sat in that booth like she owned it. He'd been feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who has restored what he considers the proper order of things. He sighed and answered the phone. "What?" "Sheriff." Lewis's voice had that quality it got when he was about to deliver something bad. The voice of a man 5 years from retirement who had spent all 5 of the preceding years being afraid. "We got a problem. FBI just showed up at the station. 2 agents. They're asking about an incident this morning at Lou's Diner." Smith's hand tightened on the glass. "They got a video, Sheriff, of you and the... I'll be there in 10 minutes. He threw a 20 on the bar and walked out. His mind was already moving, sorting, looking for the angle. Lou didn't have working cameras. Smith had seen to that years ago, after the owner had made noises about installing security. Smith had come by and explained very pleasantly that a security system might attract attention from people who had nothing better to do than look for things to complain about. Lou had understood. But Lou wasn't the only one in that diner this morning. The young waitress, Emma, standing near the kitchen door. Smith's jaw tightened so hard his back teeth hurt. He pulled into the station parking lot at 7:23 p.m. 2 dark SUVs with government plates sat in the lot. He made note of the numbers automatically, a habit. Inside, Deputy Lewis was hovering near the entrance with the expression of a man considering whether vomiting would help. 2 people in dark suits stood in the lobby. The woman spoke first. "Sheriff Smith, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Harding. This is Special Agent Chen. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred this morning at Lou's Family Diner." Smith deployed the smile. He'd been perfecting it for 9 years. Wide, disarming, the smile of a man with nothing to hide, which he'd specifically cultivated because he had plenty. "Sure thing, agents. Though I have to say, sending federal officers out here for a little disturbance call seems like overkill. We handle our own business in Milbrook." "We'll determine what constitutes overkill," Harding said. Her voice was flat and certain as pavement. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" He led them to his office, his desk, his diplomas, his photos, shaking hands with the county commissioner, the state representative, spanning your entire tenure as sheriff. "We'll be examining every arrest, every use of force, every complaint you've dismissed, and your department's financials. We'll be speaking with former deputies." She moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. The gesture had the quality of theater because it was theater and she had earned the right to it. "You're going to want that lawyer, Sheriff, because when we're done, you won't just lose your badge." She held his gaze. "You'll lose your freedom." After they left, Smith sat very still behind his desk. He could hear his own breathing. For the first time in 9 years, for possibly the first time since he put on a badge, Ronald Smith understood what it felt like to be in a room that didn't belong to him. The trial took place 4 months later in the federal courthouse in Savannah. Catherine Carlock sat in the front row of the gallery every day. She wore her Sunday best. She brought a book and read it during recesses. She ate the lunch she packed each morning, sandwich, apple, tea in a thermos, on a bench outside the courthouse. She was orderly and composed and present, and she did not look away from the proceedings, even when what was presented was difficult to hear. Victor sat beside her. He had taken formal leave from work. He would not have been anywhere else. The prosecution presented the video, which had by this point been viewed by roughly 6 million people across various platforms. Presented in the courtroom on a large screen, in silence, it did what it had always done, simply showed what had happened. They presented 23 witnesses. Each account was precise and consistent and devastating in its specificity. The specific words, the specific dates, the specific sums of money exchanged. Collective testimony like that, the prosecution's lead attorney told the jury in her closing argument, wasn't conspiracy, it was pattern, and pattern was truth. Marcus Reyes's journal was read into the record over 2 days, 312 pages. The courtroom was very quiet during those 2 days. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes. Guilty on all counts. No one cheered. People exhaled. A few wept quietly. Catherine sat very still and nodded once, the nod of a woman confirming something she had known for a very long time. Judge Olivia Thornton looked down at Smith over her reading glasses. She was in her 60s, had grown up in rural Georgia, had driven 45 minutes each way to a better high school because the one in her town was inadequate in ways that were not accidental. She had built her career through scholarships and night jobs and the particular forward motion of a woman who was not going to be stopped. "Mr. Smith," she said. The courtroom was very quiet. "You were given a sacred trust, a badge and the authority to protect and serve your community. That trust is not a small thing. It is extended with the understanding that those who carry it will honor it, that the law in their hands will be applied with fairness and equal regard for every person it touches." She paused. "Instead, you used that authority to brutalize, to extort, and to terrorize the very people you swore to protect. You targeted the vulnerable. You silenced the victims. You destroyed documentation specifically to prevent accountability. And you did it believing, the evidence makes this clear, that you would never face consequences." She removed her reading glasses. "You were wrong." 18 years. Smith showed no emotion as he was led away. The shackles made a small metallic sound as they clicked into place. He walked out between 2 marshals without looking back. Catherine watched him go. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She nodded, that same quiet nod, the nod of something restored. Outside, in the afternoon sun, Victor stood beside his mother on the courthouse steps. Emma Bledsoe was there too, having driven down from Milbrook before dawn. She and Catherine embraced, and Emma was crying, and Catherine held her face in both hands for a moment, the way a mother holds someone she has decided to love, and said something quiet that Victor couldn't hear. He didn't need to. 1 year later, Milbrook looked different. Not dramatically, not transformed beyond recognition. The pine trees were the same. The main street had the same businesses in the same buildings. The diners still smelled of bacon grease and coffee. Transformation at that scale takes generations, and nobody was pretending otherwise. But something had shifted in the way the town held itself.
The new sheriff was a woman named Angela Reeves, recruited from Atlanta, who had instituted body cameras in her first week, a civilian oversight board in her second, and community meetings, real ones, with real follow-up, in her first month. It wasn't magic. There were deputies who chafed. There were community members whose distrust ran too deep for gestures of transparency, and they were right to be careful. Healing of that kind doesn't arrive on a schedule. But the cameras rolled, the meetings happened, complaints were received and answered by people who were not the people being complained about. It was a beginning. Lou's diner had been renovated with funds from a civil settlement. New booths, still red vinyl but without the duct tape, refinished floors, warm lighting replacing the harsh fluorescence that had given the place, for 30 years, the ambiance of an interrogation room. Near the front door, Lou had installed a small bronze plaque that read, "In recognition of the courage of Catherine Carlock and all who stood up for justice, this table is yours." The table was booth 4, near the window with the view of the Presbyterian church. Catherine still came every Thursday morning. She sat in her usual spot and read and drank her coffee for as long as she wanted. She was working through a collection of James Baldwin essays that Victor had sent for Christmas. She was taking her time with it. Nobody bothered her. What had changed was both small and enormous. She occupied her corner of the diner without calculation, without the constant low-level arithmetic of how much space she was permitted, how long she was permitted to stay, whether her presence might be read as a provocation by someone with the power to make her pay for it. She was simply there. She'd told Victor on the phone that it was one of the best feelings she'd ever had. He'd sat with that for a long time after they hung up, thinking about what it meant that so simple a thing, being left alone in a public place without fear, could feel like such a profound gift. Thinking about how long she'd been carrying the weight of that arithmetic without telling him. Thinking about the years he'd built his life in Washington and told himself it was her choice to stay, that he respected her autonomy, which he did. But under that, something simpler and harder. He hadn't wanted to look too closely at what she was living with, because looking too closely would have required him to do something about it. He visited more often now, every 6 months or so, sometimes more. He drove down Friday evenings and left Sunday afternoons. They spent the weekends in the rhythms of a life he'd kept at arm's length for 20 years. The garden center on Saturday mornings, Sunday services, long evenings on the porch swing his father had built. The hardware Thomas had drilled into the eave held 2 adults and the weight of everything that had happened. Victor thought about that sometimes. His father had been a construction worker, a man who worked with his hands, who thought carefully about load-bearing and structural integrity. He never wanted his son to work with his hands for money, he made that clear. But he also taught Victor by example and occasionally by explicit instruction that the things worth doing were worth doing with care. On a warm October morning, exactly a year after the assault, they sat across from each other in that booth. The morning light fell in long gold slants through the window, the particular quality of fall light that makes everything look like it's being painted. "You ever regret it?" Victor asked, "letting me make those calls?" Catherine looked at him with those steady eyes that always saw him more clearly than he saw himself. "Baby," she said, "I didn't let you do anything. You did what sons do." A pause. A lot of people's lives got upended in that investigation, people who made choices about whose side they were on. Catherine held her coffee cup in both hands. "I don't celebrate their trouble, but I don't carry it either. They made their choices. And a lot of people got free." She looked out the window. On the street, a young woman pushed a stroller. Two men talked on the corner in the relaxed way of men who aren't watching for trouble. Smith was suffocating this town, and sometimes you have to burn out the rot to let new things grow. "You sound like a revolutionary," Victor said. "I'm a mother," she said. She looked back at him. Same thing, really. Outside, Milbrook went about its ordinary, extraordinary business. People walked dogs, kids rode bikes. The sun lit the street in that warm October way. And the town that fear had built was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with all the difficulty that real learning requires, of what it meant to become something else. Justice hadn't been easy, it hadn't been fast, it hadn't arrived.